Okay, whenever you're ready.
I'm sure you've all heard of Germans from Russia. Well, my parents were both Germans from Russia too. Did you know how that all got started? There was a young woman of German descent who married a Russian Tsar. The Tsar died at a rather young age, and since she was looked upon as a very intelligent woman, they decided to make her the Tsar. So she was known as Catherine the Great. At that time, there was a severe food shortage in Russia. Even though the Ukraine area was a good farming area, the Russians simply didn't know how to farm. Well, Catherine knew that her German relatives back in Germany were good farmers, so she created a new law. She gave free land to any German family that would move over to Russia and farm. They had to stay there for a certain length of time too. They received about 140 acres. Their measuring of land at that time was different than what it is here in the United States. My grandma Sittner, Elizabeth Seidel was her name, her maiden name. When she was a young girl, she served as a maid to the wife of one of the czars. After the Germans were settled in Germany and farming, their horses were considered pretty valuable property. And so the Germans built barns to keep their horses in at night. But the Russians were constantly stealing their horses. This one farmer had a barn with a hole in the door. In order to unlock the door, you had to reach through the hole to reach the lock inside. This one night, the farmer put a lasso around that hole and sat in the barn all night. And sure enough, here came the horse thieves. He could hear them. And then he saw the arm come through the hole. So he cinched up his lasso as tight as he could and held it. Well, he couldn't escape. The Russian horse thief couldn't escape, but he had friends with him too, and that was no problem. They just cut his arm off and left. After a period of time, the Russians felt that it wasn't fair that none of the Germans were serving in their army. So they created a new law that said when a German boy reached a certain age, he had to join the Russian army. For that reason, the two older brothers in my dad's family left for America about 2 years before the rest of the family. They traveled to the town of Hosmer, South Dakota, and stayed there with some relatives. About 2 years later, the rest of the family arrived. They also went to Hosmer, and while they were there, they were able to buy wagons and horses and other things that they would need where they were going to homestead. It sure makes you think that President Abraham Lincoln got the idea of his Homestead Act from Catherine the Great. Lincoln's Homestead Act was to get the people to move farther west in the United States and develop that part of the country. Well, the Frey family left Hosmer, they traveled west. When they got to the Missouri River, the only way to get across was on a pontoon bridge, which was located about in the same area as New Everett is today. After they had crossed the Missouri River, they traveled on west and north until they reached the Grand River. Well, there was no bridge across the Grand River. The local people told my grandpa that the river was running too high, it was not safe to cross, and that he had to wait a while until it would go down. Well, he wasn't much for patience, so they crossed anyway. Well, they lost most of their possessions off of one of the wagons, but all the people and livestock did get across safely. From there, after they had crossed the Grand, they traveled on north and a little west until they reached the location of their homestead, which was about 5 miles south of the town of White Butte. Incidentally, someone with the name Frey has lived on that old original Frey homestead for at least the last 110 years. My mother's parents, the Sittners, they homesteaded near Meadow, South Dakota. After my parents were married, they lived in the little town of White Butte. There my dad operated the local filling station and garage. Quite often, if my dad was out busy repairing an old Model T Ford or changing some tires for somebody, and another car drove up and needed gas, then it was my mom's duty to go out and fill gas. To do that, she had to pump a big hand pump to pump the gas up into a glass tank up above her head that was marked off in gallons. That's how they determined how many gallons they put in each car. When I was a kid, White Butte was a thriving little town. There was a post office, a grocery store, a bank, a filling station, a pool hall, and 3 churches. A Lutheran church, a Baptist church, and a Catholic church. Besides a lot of little homes too, and a grain elevator along the railroad track. I came from a fairly large family. There were 3.5 dozen of us. First there were 3 boys, then there was a half a dozen girls. All 9 of us graduated from Northwestern Lutheran Academy here in Mobridge. At that time, the boys lived in the boys' dormitory. That was long before the girls' dormitory was built. But the girls had to live in upstairs apartments above 2 of the professors' homes. I didn't get to see my folks that first year until we went home for Christmas vacation. When I was home, my mom was asking me about different things in the school. I told her about this one boy from Montana that was such a good barber. He always cut the hair for all the boys in the dorm, and we paid him 25 cents a haircut. I also told him about that ugly red-headed girl that had long red braids that sat right ahead of me in most classes. I just couldn't stand her. Oftentimes on a Saturday, a bunch of us boys would walk out west toward the old car bridge. Right near the car bridge was an irrigated garden owned by Steve Denoff. He always had work for us to do. We'd help him weed his garden or plant his vegetables or harvest his vegetables, whatever was to be done. At the end of the day, he would always pay us each $3. And then we'd all climb in the back of his old pickup and he'd take us back to the academy, just in time for the evening meal. About 7 years later, I married that ugly redhead. After we were married, we lived in a little house on the same farm as my wife's parents, John and Rose Ravenberg. I farmed with my father-in-law for 14 years, and then he died. My wife's youngest brother, Ted, decided it was time for him to take the farm over. Well, our children were already attending the day school at Zion Lutheran Church, and we decided maybe we should locate closer to Mobridge. So one day I went to town and visited with 3 different realtors in town. None of them had anything available. I was very disappointed. I got in my pickup and I was just starting for home. I was driving east on the street just south of the post office when I heard this weird noise. I looked in my rearview mirror and here was Bob Larson running after me. He was one of the realtors I had just talked to. He was waving his arms and whistling. That's what that noise I heard. Of course, I stopped and he told me that he had a cousin that had a quarter of land 6 miles northeast of Mobridge that he would sell. We drove out and looked at it and I thought, well, that's a pretty good piece of farm ground. After I showed it to my wife, we decided to buy it and build a home there. The first thing we did was hire a well driller to drill us a well. Near the location where we drilled the well was a mound of dirt. We didn't know what it was, but the old timers told us it was the remains of an old sod house. Vic Schlomer had a backhoe at that time, so I hired him to dig us the basement. After we had the basement dug, I hired a contractor to pour the concrete basement and foundation. Of course, I had to borrow some money to do that, so I went to the local Citizens Bank. While I was visiting with the banker, he told me about this wealthy retired serviceman that was building a new city in the Phoenix, Arizona area. They called it Sun City. And he and his wife had just bought a home down there where they planned to spend the winters. In order to build a home, I went to the local lumberyard operated by Paul Steen. He introduced me to one of his salesmen. The salesman told me about these ready-built homes that were built in Rapid City, and they would deliver them on a big semi-truck. My wife and I picked out a floor plan and ordered a home. After the foundation was poured and everything, sometime later the house arrived. Paul Steen had a carpenter named Marvin Getz. He was in charge of seeing to it that the house was fitted properly on the foundation and all the doors and windows were fitted properly. Not too long a time, we were able to move into the house. A few years later, my son Roger and his wife Sheila built a home about a quarter mile south of our house. when I bought land, I would deal with the Federal Land Bank. At that time it was called the Federal Land Bank. Today it's called Farm Credit Services. Later on we built a seed cleaning plant and a truck scale and started raising seed and selling it. We would order foundation seed from the university in Brookings, and that seed that we planted would produce registered seed. Registered seed would produce certified seed, and certified seed just produced common seed. At that time we grew spring wheat and winter wheat and durum wheat, oats and barley and flax. In case you don't know what durum wheat was, or what it is, that's used for making pasta. After our seed was growing and ready to harvest, a field inspector would come out and check it over for noxious weeds and whatnot. And then after the seed was harvested and cleaned, we had to send a sample to Brookings to check it for purity and germination. When we loaded a customer with seed, of course, we had to weigh the truck on the scale first, then fill it, and then after it was filled, we'd have to weigh it again to determine how many bushels were loaded. We had a system of timing the auger so we could tell how many bushels we got on for the customer. We had customers that came from miles away, some of them even from out of state, as far away as Wisconsin. Today, Roger and Jeff continue the seed operation. If you look in the local newspapers during the spring of the year, you'll see their ads with the various varieties of wheat that are available. My son Tim graduated from the School of Mines in Rapid City with a degree in electrical engineering. After he was out of school, he immediately got a job in Phoenix working for Honeywell. Naturally, we went down there to visit him shortly after he got settled there, and that was in the month of July. I remember we stayed in a motel, and in the morning I got up about 5 o'clock, and I thought, well, I'm going to go out walking while it's nice and cool. I went out the motel door at 5 o'clock and it was 95 degrees. I haven't been back to Arizona much during the summer. My wife and I did spend 37 winters as snowbirds in Arizona, in the Phoenix area, usually in Sun City West. We never owned a home there. We knew a lady in Sun City West that always had over 100 homes to rent out to snowbirds. We could contact her by email, and she would send us pictures of the various homes, pictures of the rooms, and we could select the one we wanted before we went down there. Some years ago, my wife and I decided to retire. So we bought a home in town and sold our farm home to our grandson, Jeff. The last winter we spent in Arizona, my wife got sick shortly after we arrived down there. She spent about 5 months in several different hospitals and 3 or 4 different nursing homes before she passed away. She would go to see a cardiologist occasionally, and he told her that she had a torn heart valve. If she had been younger, he would have operated on her to correct the problems, but at her age, he said she would never survive. I lost my wife 3 years ago last May. If you were to drive back 10 miles west of Lemon today to see the town of White Butte, you might be surprised that there's only the old grain elevator by the railroad track. Nothing else is left, not a thing. Thank you.